I want to, before I get started, just introduce myself and say thank you for attending. My name is Brooke Green. I'm the project manager for the Collister concept study. Several of you we have visited with before, but I'm glad to be back before you again. This is our third outreach effort pertaining to Collister. In particular, we're here because we have done some significant evaluations to the corridor itself since the last time we talked. But before I get into the details of the concept itself, I do want to go over a couple ground rules and talk about ways in which you guys can communicate to us as we move through this project this afternoon. First of all, I just want to highlight our Menti. Menti.com, you'll see it there at the top of the screen. That is how we're going to engage with you at the end when we ask a series of questions, want to get your feedback. The whole intent is for us to have this interactive opportunity where you can participate in giving us feedback, but while at the same time you can see what some of your neighbors are saying. I also just want to go over a couple ways in which you guys can communicate with us as we're going through this, because we know questions are going to arise. First, I just want to highlight our chat. Our chat box is there to ask questions, engage with your neighbors, provide some commentary. But I do want to set some ground rules as you guys go about chatting with one another. Please be respectful of your neighbors. Certainly, a lot of people will have some opinions, but we also want to be respectful of those opinions. So please, do not cuss or use foul language as you're chatting. We do want to respect and acknowledge that we may all have differing opinions. It's important, though, that you guys have an opportunity to have that conversation. As it pertains to Q&A, this is where you will be able to submit questions to us and have our staff respond. We want you guys to use the Q&A function. Primarily, it's because it also allows us to capture your questions in perpetuity as this project goes forward. So if you're going to use chat, that's fine, but just acknowledge if you're asking a question in chat for our staff, our preference is that you guys use Q&A, and we're going to be monitoring that throughout this whole concept conversation here in a moment. I have designated a full hour in which to review this, and I want to be respectful of your time, and so we'll go ahead and get started. And pull up the... All right. I do want to highlight that throughout this whole, I'm going to be asking for slides to switch over as we go through this. So should I say that out loud? It's only so I can give guidance to my team here. I also want to highlight who here is on our team. We have our staff engineer. We have our technical assistants from our consultants. The project team is made up of City of Boise representatives as well as ACHD. And so we do have a robust technical team that did this evaluation. Want to highlight, this is, I said, this is our third time coming out to you, so it's really incredibly important that you guys engage with us. But I also want to note, we have a survey open, so should you not be able to attend today or your neighbors are not able to attend, I want to encourage them to go and fill out the survey. It's the exact same material we're going over, it's just in a static form on our website. With that being said, I'd like to go ahead and jump into the project itself. Next slide. So this is information on how you can get in touch with us following today's presentation. If you have questions specifically for me, as I mentioned, my name is Brooke Green and my phone number is listed right there. Please use projects@achd.org to send in any questions or any inquiries that you may have following today's meeting. Today's virtual meeting will be held in two parts. So if your neighbors weren't able to attend today at 3:30, I want to encourage them to come back at 5:30, and we're here to answer any questions that you may have. And like I mentioned, the survey is still there, it's static for one more week, so take a look. With that being said, I'd like to chat about how we got here. What you see before you is our calendar of all the work in which we have accomplished this past year. So we were back before you June of 2021. That is our initial contact pertaining to this particular project. We revisited back in November. This was when we took our technical team to evaluate the project, looked to some concepts. It was December where we shared those concepts and asked for your additional feedback. Between December and now, based off of the feedback we received from all of the neighbors and those who participated in the process, we went back and did a deeper dive. Because when we originally came out here to evaluate this, once we walked away with all of your guys' feedback, we realized tree canopy and property impacts were incredibly important. And so between February and March, we went and did an additional analysis, and we looked along the corridor, went from one parcel to the next, evaluating tree canopy. Were they within the public right-of-way? What potential impacts could be? And we took that information as a technical team and we presented and will be presenting to you this evening alternatives that took all of that into account. So here we are again in August and September. Our goal is to take this project into adoption here this coming fall. When we came out to you, what we heard was we had three concepts before you: concept 1, concept 2, and concept 3. You're going to see the response from all of those, and you see them listed there. All responses, and then Collister Drive residents, and then adjacent street residents. It's incredibly important that we hear from folks who reside on Collister, so we do have that listed there, and we do take into account those who provide any input. Do you live on Collister, or do you live off of Collister? Because we recognize this property and property owners along the corridor, what we do to the street will have a significant impact there along the corridor, and more importantly, out your front door. As I mentioned, I'll quickly go over some of the actions that we took as we went through this. So while we recognize you guys have a very unique corridor, the reason we're here is because we overwhelmingly heard the need for pedestrian facilities. And so our concepts do focus primarily on pedestrian facilities. We also heard overwhelmingly that there's a lot of speeding issues that occur along this corridor. And so our concepts do take into account mitigating the speeding issue throughout this. When we came to you, we looked at concept 1, 2, and 3. What you're going to see tonight is only concept 2 and 3 because we have eliminated concept 1 for any further consideration. If you'll go ahead and scroll and we'll talk about that. We eliminated Collister Drive concept 1. Primarily it's because it actually also received the lowest number of support. It had several concerns pertaining to the on-street bike facility. Folks often felt that that did not provide a level of protection necessary for cyclists navigating through that space. It was also the largest footprint and provided the greatest impact to trees and properties. And that was one of the front-runner reasons while we went and did this evaluation is, can we bring forward concepts that mitigate any impacts to trees and mitigate impacts to property? And so the two concepts that we're going to provide to you here in a moment, we take that into account. We can scroll down a little bit. And before I move any further, can we go back to actions taken? And can we scroll down a little bit? When we went into concepts 2 and 3, and based off of the feedback we received from you, our original concept, concept 2, had 41 trees impacted. Based off our analysis, we were able to reduce that and save 24 trees. So for concept 2, which is the smallest footprint that I will go through here in a moment, we have an impact of 17 trees along this whole corridor. Scroll down. As it pertains to concept 3, this is one of our larger footprints that we're going to show to you this evening. Concept 3, the original concept, had 57 trees impacted. Based off of our analysis and some modifications that we made to concept 3, we have done a revision and we have managed to save almost 50% of the trees. And so we've saved approximately 28 trees. So between concept 2 and concept 3, it's about a 12 tree impact. We can go back to concept 2. I'm going to go over what that looks like. So concept 2 is still under consideration, and we are asking for your feedback about that this evening. The west side, I'm going to go through this. This footprint is the smaller of the two. Some important things to note. The multi-use pathway that you see highlighted there and the buffer that you see highlighted there, in addition to the footprint, for us to mitigate any impacts to trees and properties, we reduce those. More importantly, the multi-use pathway was reduced by a foot, and the buffer, based off of its impact along the corridor and its impact on adjacent properties, we will reduce that accordingly. Something also to note is this does still provide on-street parking, as both concepts only provide on-street parking there on the west side. We reduce the travel lanes down to 10.5 feet. That is actually a traffic calming measure. And then you see the buffer and the multi-use pathway. What this looks like in some areas, we've got the RFB for the pedestrian crossing north of State Street and John's Landing. That's an addition that is reflected in both concepts. Something to note, we have dedicated bike lanes from Catalpa Drive to John's Landing, and this is to help facilitate the bikeway that traverses through this area. It comes from John's Landing and then actually goes further on to Catalpa. This is a dedicated bike lane on the west side as opposed to parking, and primarily it's because we don't have front-on housing at that location. Continue, scroll down please. We're going to talk about the east side. There's bulb outs throughout this whole corridor to provide for pedestrian crossings and enhance that a little bit more, but those also provide a traffic calming measure. And then we have got the RFB pedestrian crossing north of State Street at Johns Landing. Some modifications that I highlighted as we reduced the multi-use pathway, we narrowed the buffer width as I highlighted earlier along some properties. And that's really so that way we can ensure saving as many trees as we possibly can. If we can scroll down further, I'm going to go over some more detail. Go ahead. And so this is what your property looks like, your street looks like as today, and with the enhancement. This is what it looks like. I want to go over some benefits and some pros and cons. You know, this does provide traffic calming by narrowing the lanes, which is incredibly important because we heard folks speed through this corridor. Bike and pedestrians can use this pathway. We know the whole intention of this project was to provide enhanced pedestrian facilities because we know there's some incredibly important attractors. To the south, you've got the library, you've got the Greenbelt access, you've got the coffee shops, and to the north, you have got Foothill Trail access. So this whole project is centered around being able to enhance pedestrian facilities, both for cyclists as well as pedestrians. As I mentioned, this has the smallest footprint than both concepts before you. Bulb outs and RFPs are incredibly key to ensuring safe access and crossing through this corridor. And this does accommodate bus access. As we know, Valley Regional Transit does have bus services along this corridor. I do want to highlight with everything, there are some challenges. And so quickly, all your pedestrian facilities are only located on the east side. Now, what that means is should there ever be any maintenance that occurs along this corridor on that multi-use pathway, we will not have adjacent pedestrian facilities on the west side to detour folks. And so we'll have to use traffic calming traffic companies to help provide any detours should that occur. On-street parking is removed on the west side of the road from Johns Landing, Catalpa, but as I mentioned earlier, that is not on street, that is not front on housing. In addition to that, it provides that access for that northwest bikeway that traverses through this area. If you can scroll on down a little bit further. So you've got concept 2. Now, when we came forward with this, we wanted to ensure that we adhere to our level of traffic stress pertaining to bikes and peds. We did an evaluation both on concept 2 as well as the concept 3. For pedestrian level of traffic stress, it is at a 2. And so we're confident that the pedestrian facility that we are proposing does provide the level of protection for folks to comfortably navigate through this space. Bicycle level of stress is 1, which is certainly achieves that goal by providing that designated space removed from the vehicles there with the multi-use pathway. Improved footprint is anywhere from 42 to 44 as it varies throughout this whole corridor. And the improved footprint there from Johns Landing to Catalpa, 41 to 45. I'm not going to scroll through each one of these as each one, you can go into more depth at a later date or time, but I do just want to highlight what you're seeing before you, some opportunities where we did make some enhancements. And so at the bottom aerial, you're going to see we reduced the buffer at this particular property. If we can just hover over that so they can see it. So you can, I'm sorry. So we do have call outs throughout this whole area where we will show you where we've reduced the buffer to be able to provide from some of that, address some of that property impact. I'll call your attention to this really quick is you're going to see there in green on the upper aerial, and that's that on-street bike facility, and that's to help facilitate those coming from Johns Landing to Catalpa on the northwest bikeway. I also want to highlight there at Johns Landing, you're going to see that we completed the sidewalk connectivity, and if you can hover over that on the top aerial to your right. Yep. So we completed that sidewalk. Right now there's a gap of sidewalk, and while we recognize that that's not necessarily on Collister, it is an important connection to Collister, and so I want to highlight that that was a suggestion we received from those who were participating in this feedback that we've gotten. We'll go ahead and scroll further down, and I'm not going to go through each one of those pages. I'll let you do that here. Right there is what you see, the pedestrian level of traffic stress, if you want to spend a little bit more time. Why concept 2 is still under considerations. 39 participants who participated in the initial outreach did favor this one as one of their front-running concepts. As I mentioned, the level of traffic stress does adhere to ACHD's commitment to providing for bikes and pedestrians and enhancing that protection for folks navigating through this space. And as mentioned, this is the smallest footprint. And when we did our field inventory, we were trying to find a option that be able to provide for pedestrian facilities while also addressing and mitigating both tree as well as property impacts. So concept 1 certainly is the smallest footprint as in comparison to concept 2, and we wanted to make sure that we had that as an alternative moving forward. Can we go ahead and scroll down? This is some enhancements, and just quickly, if we can go back to the bulb outs, I'm not going to click on these, but bulb outs as well, if you control up the RFB, this is to be able to provide for enhanced pedestrian access throughout the whole corridor. Bulb outs are a traffic calming measure, and RFB is, you can actually hit a button, stop vehicles, so enabling you to cross, and you're going to see that there reflected in the aerial up at the top. If you can hover over that in a moment, that is where we are highlighting that an RFB will be at that location. And it's to help people facilitate folks crossing at John's Landing to get to the multi-use pathway. If we can go ahead and scroll down, we're going to get into concept 3. So concept 3 is still under consideration. This is your largest footprint option, and you're going to see that denoted down there at the bottom. Why this is important is it provides pedestrian facilities on both sides. Whereas the previous concept only had pedestrian facilities there on the east side, you're going to see reflected here that on the east side we retain that multi-use pathway, providing for both bikes and pedestrians. It is at 10 feet and primarily so we can minimize property impacts. You're going to see that buffer located there. It's from 1 to 3 feet. Again, it's because throughout this whole corridor, we took into account opportunities where we can minimize property impacts and tree impacts. And for us to achieve that, we would actually have to shrink that buffer from 1 to 3 feet. You're going to see there the travel lanes do not change, 10.5 feet for both of them. And again, that's a traffic calming measure. But more importantly, what you see with this concept that you did not see with the concept 2 is the addition of a 6-foot sidewalk. So what you have here is pedestrian facilities on both the east as well as the west side. RFB still applies throughout this. And another big difference is rather than on-street bike facilities on the west side between Catalpa and John's Landing, we actually have a buffered multi-use pathway. And that's, again, to facilitate folks coming from Catalpa to John's Landing on the Northwest Boise Bikeway. If we scroll further down, then I want to highlight some of the modifications that we did. And these were modifications based off of the feedback, and this applies to both of them. We reduced the multi-use pathway from 11 feet to 10 feet. We narrowed, as I mentioned, that buffer throughout this whole corridor. And I'll go in more depth here in a moment what that actually looks like. And we removed small portions of on-street parking on the west side south of Catalpa, and that was primarily to minimize tree impacts. We did an evaluation of tree impacts throughout this whole corridor, taking into account the diameter of the tree, the health of the tree. And so in an effort to minimize that, that was part of our study. This is the location between Catalpa drives to John's Landing. Again, this is the area where we didn't have front-on housing on the west side, which enabled us to provide and suggest that we use a higher level of protection for folks navigating, again, from John's Landing to Catalpa. In this case, you have a multi-use pathway, whereas the previous concept, it was on-street bike facilities. So in this location, you have multi-use pathways on both sides. You have those 3-foot buffers, and then you have the travel lanes. And again, it's because at that location, there is no front-on housing on the west side, enabling us to be able to put this enhancement and suggestion forward. We can scroll down a little bit more. This is what it looks like. This is your street as it is today. And based off of your feedback and some analysis, this is one of the proposals, concept 3, that we're putting forward. Some highlights you see there depicted: the multi-use pathway, the buffer, the vehicle travel lane, on-street parking, and the sidewalk. As I mentioned, similar to concept 2, we narrowed the travel lanes, and that was because we wanted to address the speeding concerns that were expressed by several of the residents along this corridor. Narrowing the travel lanes is a traffic calming measure. I do want to highlight narrowing the travel lanes is really, this is actually pretty standard practice throughout Ada County. This is not the first time we've looked to a residential or a collector residential street and looked at it and said, can we narrow travel lanes to be able to provide for traffic calming? A really good example that is similar to this would be Kootenai Street, where with Kootenai Street, you do have a lot of vehicles that traverse through the area. We too also narrow the travel lanes to be able to mitigate that speeding concerns expressed by the residents. So this is not a new application. This is an application that is fairly standard and one that we have been utilizing throughout Ada County in the past couple years. Pedestrian facilities on both sides of the street. Bike and pedestrian facilities can use the pathway. I don't need to highlight the many attractors along your guys' very unique street because we recognize that you want to get to the foothills and you want to be able to get to both the library. These are attractors that are important to you. This is one of the reasons in which you live there. We respect that. That is why we're doing this analysis. Sidewalk improvements, like I mentioned, John's Landing, and that's connect to Cynthia Mann Elementary School. We maintain parking, just like we did with the previous concept, on the west side. In addition to that, Landing and Hill Road, we have bulb outs as RFBs. That doesn't change. The locations of those are the same as they were in concept 2. And really it's to be able to, one, address traffic calming while at the same time enhancing pedestrian crossings at some of those locations. But just like concept 2, concept 3 has its own challenges. On-street parking is removed on the east side of the road. While I recognize that it's an incredible concern for folks, we would not be able to achieve any type of enhancements to this corridor without the removal of on-street parking on at least one of the sides. And primarily it's because when we put this forward, we want to minimize any impacts to properties as well as minimize any impacts to tree canopy. If we did not remove parking on one side, we would not be able to provide these pedestrian enhancements without having to widen our footprint. We really did want to achieve this without having to widen our footprint as much as possible to minimize those impacts. Has the biggest footprint, as I highlighted. This is the biggest of the two. And then, of course, as highlighted earlier, this does have a significant tree impact, approximately 24 to 28 trees along the corridor. But I'm going to talk about ways in which we mitigated that here in the following slides. We can scroll down. So what you see here, just as concept 2, the level of traffic stress stays the same with both of these options. For pedestrians, it's a 2. For cyclists, it's a 1. And it's because we're removing cyclists off the road. Here's where we actually did a little bit more of analysis. And so I want to draw your attention to this aerial on the bottom slide. And in particular, you're going to see where you see on-street parking is denoted with blue. And you're going to see there's a little bulb out spots. If we can scroll back to where you just were on the screen. No. On the aerial, go back down. So where we had it denoted with blue for on-street parking, if we can highlight that on the second aerial. And if you can stop to the right a little bit, there's a bulb out at this point. And primarily it's because we identified 3 trees. If we can scroll over just a little bit more. Right there. So you're going to see that the on-street parking in front of those 3 parcels was removed, and it was because we want to minimize tree impacts. There's 3 large mature trees at that location that we recognize as an option to minimize tree canopy. This was an opportunity in which, because of adjacent streets do have parking available on them, that we could remove parking at this location to be able to minimize tree impacts. If you can go ahead and right there. If you can hover over on the far right side right there, you're going to see where we did one impact to one of the properties where we were trying to minimize property impacts. We reduced the buffer. And so you can see it at this location where we have it denoted in the call out. At that particular property, to be able to save 17 trees, we reduced the buffer at that location. If you can click over to the next slide. And you see that at the Catalpa and Bloom Street. If you can, at the top aerial, Catalpa and Bloom. Right there, you're going to see at Catalpa and Bloom again, where that multi-use pathway was reduced to be able to reduce impacts to the trees. And you're going to see this call out. This takes place throughout the whole corridor. I'm not going to go any further into these different slides. I just want to encourage you to go and take a look at these, because as we get to particular locations where there's trees on properties, we reduce the buffer accordingly so we would not impact those trees. Now, we couldn't necessarily do that throughout the whole corridor because several of these trees are located in public right-of-way. And for us to be able to provide these facilities, we had to look to those trees that were located in public right-of-way. And unfortunately, that would be somewhat of the 20 plus trees are impacted as a result of this concept. If we can scroll down. Again, I'm going to let you guys spend some time. Why number 3 is still in consideration. So when we did this original outreach, 47% were in favor of this concept, so it was the front runner. Participants viewed this as the most versatile and safest option because it provided for pedestrian facilities on both sides. The level of traffic stress doesn't change. They're the same for both cyclists as well as pedestrians on both of these options, but we look to this as being one of our front runner options for you guys to provide feedback. Again, concept 2 is the smallest footprint, whereas concept 3 is the largest. We can go ahead and scroll down a little bit more. Again, the RFB, which is that rectangular rapid flashing beacon, stays the same, as well as the bulb outs, and you can certainly take a look at those by clicking on the PDFs if you have any additional questions. This concludes my review of the concepts. I do want to talk about next steps. So we have been before you for approximately a full year now at talking about Collister concepts. At this point, this is our last public outreach, and so your participation is incredibly important. Whether you live on the street or you use the street, your feedback is going to help us make a determination which concept is appropriate to move forward. In addition to that, if you reside on the street, we want to encourage you and your neighbors to get out there, fill out the survey if you're not able to attend this evening or in the next session. The survey link is provided on our ECHD website and is going to be open through September 1st. All your comments, if you reside on the street, please let us know that you reside on the street because we do take that into account when we're looking at the feedback we receive. This is ideally to be wrapped up here this September. Our anticipated adoption is we're looking into the month of November. This isn't the last time you're going to have an opportunity to provide feedback. The final option will be presented 2 weeks prior to the actual hearing itself. So we want to encourage you to take a look at that. Your last opportunity to provide feedback will be at a hearing the evening of the concept adoption, and you'll have a chance to speak directly to the commissioners. As staff, we just make recommendation. It is the commissioners who make the ultimate decision on what concept moves forward. It has been a pleasure working with all of you. Certainly, I've spent a great deal of my time out there on the street meeting with some of the residents. Again, if you have any concerns, questions, you want to get in touch with me, I encourage you to do that both at the project's email or at the phone number listed on the website. We'll take this opportunity and look at the Q&As. And so as we've been going through this, I'm sorry, we're not going to do the Q&As. I'm going to ask you Q&As and we're going to move forward in our Mentimeter. But before we do that, I'm going to press pause so you guys can have a chance to log on if you haven't already done so. Go to www.menti.com, the code listed there, 45981521. We're going to ask a series of questions in the next moment. It's incredibly important you participate. If there's any technical concerns, questions, or flaws, certainly highlight those in the Q&As. If you can't participate in the Menti itself, we will do our best to answer them in the Q&As. And again, you can always chat back and forth on the chat feature. I'm going to press pause and give you guys a moment to get on there, log on, and I'll be back before you in about 30 seconds.
So 3.
All right. So with that being said, many of you guys have already answered. Which of the two concepts presented for Collister Drive do you prefer overall? We've had several, 29% of you say you'd rather have either option. We had concept 3 at 57% and concept 2 there at 14%. Give you a few more minutes to provide your feedback before we move in as you guys are adjusting your responses. We're going to give it a moment. We've got 19 attendees where we have 11 people responding. So we've got some people who may be having some challenge getting on Mentimeter. Before we move into the next question, we'll give it just a pause. And I'll give it about 30 more seconds before we move on. And I'm just going to assume everybody can log on. So All right, with that being said, I think we can go ahead and move on to the second question. Oh, we've got a couple more, so people are logging on. So again, concept 3 is the front runner, and I'll just reiterate it one more time while you're looking at this. Concept 2 is the smaller footprint. That's the multi-use pathway that is just located there on the east side. Concept 3 is a larger footprint. That is pedestrian facilities on both sides, sidewalk on the west, as well as a multi-use pathway there on the east. We have 21% of the respondents saying they don't like either concept. Certainly, we respect that. We have 14 of the 19 people who have participated thus far. We'll go ahead and move on to the second question. Please explain why you prefer one concept over the other. If you don't like it, let us know. Here's an opportunity for you to fill it out. Again, if you're struggling to get to Mentimeter, the information and the details are listed there above, menti.com, code 45981521. I'll pause and give everybody a chance to provide their feedback. All right, I'm just going to read these out loud as they come on board. There's a preference that we have sidewalks on both sides. That's probably the interest for concept 3. Pedestrian movements on both sides is critical. Certainly that is highlighting the need for pedestrian connectivity east and west. Concept 3 seems to maximize the level of safety. We've had 4 attendees of the 19 providing feedback, but you guys are giving us commentaries, so I'm going to give it lots of time. I think having sidewalks on both sides is beneficial. I feel so unsafe walking my dog now just on the side of the road with cars zooming by. I'm incredibly excited for this. I like concept 2. It has a smaller footprint while providing a safe path down the street. Number 3 has pedestrian facilities on both sides. We've heard that and highlighted. I prefer the smaller footprint that reduces speed by its nature. The pedestrian level of stress is the same on both concepts. You're certainly right. Yes, it is. I appreciate that there is more space for pedestrians and cyclists. Having both a sidewalk as well as a multi-use pathway would allow walkers and bikers to self-select whichever side works best for them. Smaller roadway does not make anything safer. Concept 3 poses too great of a risk to cyclists and motorists due to the 6.5-foot parking is too narrow on the west side. A 2022 Ford 150 with standard side pickup, I'm trying to read through all of this, would measure 1.5 feet wider than the parking lane itself. Thank you guys for your feedback. We have 12 participants of the 19 who've provided some commentary. We'll pause just a little bit longer and give you guys a chance to give us some additional feedback before I move into the next question. Give it about 30 more seconds, and then I'm going to move on to the third question. Again, if you're struggling to get on Mentimeter, details are there at the top, code 45981521. And if you can't, but you still want to provide some feedback, I want to encourage you to do it there in the Q&A. As I mentioned earlier, all of the feedback in which you provide us, all the questions, they are recorded. This is recorded, by the way. I did mention that too when we first started. So we are using this for public comment. And I just received a new one. I don't like either. 6-mile stretch of the road is too much money. Will not decrease the speeding. There have been no fatalities and minimal accidents with no injuries. Thank you for your guys' feedback. Again, that's 14 of the 19. I'll pause just a little bit longer. On concept 2, there are spaces for walking and a sidewalk is not needed. And again, concept 2 is the smallest footprint with the multi-use pathway on the west side, on the east side. Concept 3, largest footprint with the sidewalk on the west side and the multi-use pathway there on the east side. Both concepts do provide for parking on the west side. With that being said, I think it's time that we move on to our third question. Is there anything we missed or special considerations we should take into account? Is there something, when you guys participated the first time in our outreach effort, your commentary and questions and your concerns were taken into account? That's why we paused for several months, giving an opportunity for our technical team to go out there and take a look at the property impacts as well as the tree impacts. We heard you the first time, so it's incredibly important. Is there something we missed? Are there special considerations you would like to communicate to the team? We're here to listen, and we can always take a look at that and do, if we necessary, provide any feedback as we do. So I'm going to let this pause for a moment again. It's an opportunity for you to type in your comments, and we'll wait them to arrive, and then I'll read them. All right, good point on the width of trucks. Will they cause a problem with a narrow parking lane? We can talk to that here in a moment. No, thank you for all your considerations. Perhaps additional RFB of concept 2 is selected. All Collister needs is a sidewalk both sides, the maximum street size and sharrows showing bike direction on both sides of the street. Residents that actually live on the Collister should have a greater say in what happens, since it's our property that's being impacted. Thank you, I'm so excited. Miss the reason for speeding and narrowing a lane straight road will not slow the speeders. I can provide the vehicles that are constantly speeding, yet nothing is done to enforce the speed limit by the police. Why can't we start with the least? The focus on pedestrian safety is great. I don't feel like cyclist safety has an equal consideration. Besides the bikeway between Catalpa and John's Landing, many cyclists use the entire stretch of Collister. None additional of the sidewalk along North Side Landing has been incorporated. Great work. From what I've read, a congested street is a safer street because it forces vehicles to drive slower and lessen the chance of serious injuries occurring. Could the trees be a useful buffer between cars and bikes and pets? Concept 3 still takes out too much landscaping and trees. Children and adults walking on the west side are much safer, while the east side is also safer. Again, we have 13 attendees who have provided feedback thus far. We will look to, there's 19 of yours. Some of these concepts that are still outstanding, some of these questions that are still outstanding, in a moment I will open it up for Q&A. From what I have questions, could the trees be useful buffer between cars and pedestrians and bikes? I'll speak to that just really briefly. The buffer will vary throughout the whole corridor. At 3 feet, it's too narrow in which to provide for trees to actually grow in that location. The buffer before you, in design, the treatment will be decided upon, but because we're going to have buffer, from 1 to 3 feet throughout the corridor, it's so we lessen the impacts to the trees. So while that's a good idea, we did look into it. We just do not have enough space to adequately provide for it. And lastly, have you considered the heat index of the larger footprint? That is actually why we went and did a look at the impacts to tree canopy throughout this whole corridor, was to be able to minimize that. We recognize trees provide an incredible amount of shade. We wanted to reduce the impact to that. That's why when we started with 54 in the larger footprint, based off our evaluation, was able to reduce it to 24. Several of the trees do fall within the public right-of-way and is impacted, unfortunately, with both options. And it's because we cannot provide pedestrian facilities in either option without impacting some of the trees that fall within the actual public right-of-way. With that being said, we've had 14 of the 19. We'll pause for about 30 seconds before we move on to the next question, just in case there's one more out there lingering. And there is an answer no listed there twice. I'll go ahead and read those out loud. I do want to unmute my colleague here who's going to address the question pertaining specifically to the parking that was brought up. If you could scroll up, I'm going to read that question just really quick so we can answer it. Good point on the width of trucks. Will they cause a problem with a narrow parking lane? I'm going to look to Pearson, who's going to provide some additional feedback pertaining to that question.
Yeah, so the 6.5 foot parking is actually 8 feet when you factor in the curb and gutter, which is an additional 1.5 foot, which you can park on. And that width is pretty much used throughout Ada County as the standard. So the 6.5 feet might have been a little bit misleading, but it will actually be 8 feet, which will accommodate those scenarios with respect to the large F-150 pickups and other vehicles as well.
And one last question that's lingering out there, won't the street parking be filled up with abandoned vehicles or people living in their vehicles? Certainly that is not something we're necessarily saying now. When we look to provide street parking, we look to provide street parking for the residents or visitors along the corridor, and that's the intention of ensuring that we do provide for street parking. We recognize people live along the corridor, and as a result, they will have visitors or they need to park on their street. We want to be able to provide that opportunity. Will there be Sharrow signs painted on Collister? No, this does not provide Sharrow. Sharrows are on-street bike facilities that you share with vehicles. The volumes going through this corridor was one of the reasons in which we looked to this to be able to provide enhanced bike facilities. Sharrows would not meet our level of traffic, our level of stress for cyclists, because Sharrows, because you're sharing space with vehicles, for our folks that we want to build the bike facilities for, that 8 to 80 would not feel comfortable So if you're comfortable with your 9-year-old child sharing a space with a vehicle, that's where shares would come in. And we know folks are oftentimes not comfortable with their children sharing space with vehicles on a road such as Collister. Hence why we're providing for multi-use pathways as an option. Folks with multi-use pathways, you're able to comfortably traverse through the area. It's usually for all ages, and that is why it's one of the options in both these concepts. For the street parking on the west side, will there be conflicts during trash and recycling day? Certainly that is something we have to take into account. Currently, you guys do park on both sides of the street, and that is taken into account both for trash and recycling day as it is. So that's not going to change any of the concerns for those needing to pick up the trash. It is something that you're having to deal with as of today. Moving on to the next question. Please share any additional comments you have about this project. Again, this is your chance to provide feedback. As I mentioned earlier, all of this is public record. It is reviewed by the technical team and kept in perpetuity as we move this forward into design. Again, if you need to, mentimeter.com, it's up there. Go ahead and log on if you haven't already done so. We have about 18 attendees. We'll give you a moment to fill this out and we'll get back to you. All right, take this moment, provide some feedback, and while you guys are providing feedback, I do want to talk about the Q&A here in a moment. The Q&A, you guys have had an opportunity to provide for questions. Our technical team has been on here answering them. I'm not going to read them one by one, but certainly you can all see what your neighbors and what your other folks who use this corridor are saying. Take a moment, go on there and look at the Q&As. As I mentioned, you can chat back and forth with one another through the chat itself, or you can ask us Q&A through the questions. I will review these as these come on, and we'll be back in touch in just a moment as you guys take a chance to fill it out. All right, I'm going to go ahead and read these as they come along. If the impact on our land on Collister is making it unusable for us as homeowners, will ACHD be able to buy us out at replacement costs? If not, why? And if the land we paid for is no longer usable to us? Certainly, if you have any, that is quite a question. That is one that would provide a lot of response. So I'm just going to briefly talk to it. The project we're looking forward and we're moving forward does, in several of the locations, fit within public right-of-way. Impacts to adjacent properties will be addressed per parcel. In particular, the actual use of the roadway is for all taxpayers. It is, while you may front Collister, this is a collector that provides access for several of the folks throughout this corridor. So while I recognize that there is impacts, we will work with each parcel throughout the design phase, depending on which concept moves forward, and talk about what those impacts potentially could be. However, parking in front of your street, parking is not a guarantee to the property owner that fronts it, and thus is public right-of-way. We do take that into account with all of our projects, but make no mistake, we do recognize that any project that we put forward on any of our streets throughout Ada County does have impacts. I'd certainly talk through each one of those should a parcel owner or property owner have concerns, but want to reiterate the project that we're putting forward does in several of the locations along the corridor stay within public right-of-way, and if there is property impacts, private property impacts, we will talk to each parcel owner individually. I'm really excited about the improvements being proposed to this road. Collister often feels like a barrier for east and west, cycling, pedestrian travel, and I find myself going out of my way to avoid it. Is there an enhanced bus pause stop at the lane of travel for southbound bus near Shirley Street? I'm going to speak to that because both times that I went out there and observed, I do recognize Valley Regional Transit does stop on Collister, and as a result, and in both occurrences, I did see vehicles go around them and actually cause a moment of concern. With that being said, that will be a conversation we will continue to have with Valley Regional Transit to evaluate their pause location on Collister, because in both occurrences, I did witness what you were speaking to and have taken that into account and noted it for our technical team. Thank you for seriously looking at preserving the tree canopy. The canopy is part of the neighborhood charm. We are more than happy to take that additional look that we spent the last 3 months evaluating. We do recognize tree canopy is incredibly important to any neighborhood street, and that is why the preferred alternatives had the reduction of impact that they do, and that's why both of the concepts moving forward showed those modifications. This project will help make Collister much safer for pedestrians. Will there be any additional street lighting added? It can be difficult at times to see pedestrians at night. That is actually some comments that we've received throughout this, and so when we get further along into design, that will, and should this be adopted and we get it further on into design, we can have that additional conversation about street lighting. One of the things we have to take into account, however, when it pertains to street lighting, is street lighting also adds what we call light pollution in the evening times, and so folks who reside along the corridor certainly have concerns about the addition of street lighting as it impacts their home. So that is one conversation that we can continue to have as we move this project forward. Thank you for seriously looking at I already read that one. This project will help make Collister much safer. I already read that one. Last one, I find it very concerning that people who don't live on Collister have a vote. They have other options to walk or bike. How about closing Collister at State Street and push traffic to 36th Street? As I mentioned earlier to the previous question that was highlighted, Collister and all of our streets throughout Ada County belong to all taxpayers, and that includes all users. While we recognize those who reside on the street, and we do take that into account as we move these projects forward, your input is incredibly important. We also have to take account all the users of all of our roadways. One street does not just belong to the property owners adjacent to it, but rather it belongs to our community. And that's why we make community enhancements such as this and why we move those forward for proposals. Again, this concept does go before the commission. It is the commission that makes the ultimate determination. But just as I mentioned earlier, the street is a taxpayer resource for all users throughout all of Ada County, and that is why these types of enhancements get brought to our attention and why we spend time looking at them. Last question that I have so far, thank you for the outreach and the depth at the look of the entire corridor and speaking with residents. We had 6 respondents of 17 who are still in attendance. And certainly I can pause a little bit longer if there's some additional feedback. Again, as it pertains to Q&A, I'm not going to speak to each one of those individually. We have gone through and replied to them. I want to encourage you guys who are sitting on here right now, if you have that chance, take a look at that Q&A. All your comments will be part of our public record, kept in perpetuity as this project moves forward. So if you're not providing comments, I want to encourage you in which to do so. And if you don't feel comfortable providing them here, I want to encourage you also to, like I mentioned earlier, use that project email. You can log on there, send it me a comment. All project emails are read by our commissioners, and so there's another highlight there. If you need to get in touch with me, my phone number was listed on the website itself. This will stay open for an additional week. So if your neighbors aren't here today and you want them to participate, I want to encourage you to send them to the website. The survey is open for that. I will pause just a little bit longer. Again, we have 17 attendees with 6 folks providing commentary right now. While I recognize everybody may not want to provide additional comments as you provided them earlier, but I'm just going to pause for about 30 seconds and give us a chance to conclude. All right, with that being said, this concludes our question period of this outreach effort this evening. I'm going to flip back over to the website itself, talk about how you guys can get in touch with me and what our next steps are. As I highlighted, if you guys need to get in touch with me, here's that information once more, projects@achd.org, or you can call me at Brooke Green, 208-387-6318. This survey will stay open for one more week. So as I mentioned, and I've said it several times, it's incredibly important. Your neighbors, if they're not on here providing feedback, encourage them to come on here and give us their feedback. Survey is a great way in which to participate if you were not able to participate live this evening. As I mentioned, this was recorded, and so will be available for folks who were not able to attend. And your Q&A questions will be kept for public record. This is not the last time you're going to have a chance to speak about this project. As we get closer to the adoption, you're going to be able to go before the commission and state any of your concerns or questions that you may have. Our commissioners are the ones who make the ultimate decision whether or not a project's moved forward or whether or not it is adopted. Concept 2 and 3 will be evaluated. Certainly, we do take into account all your comments, all your concerns. If there's something still outstanding that you did not feel got answered this evening, I want to encourage you to get in touch with me. I have gone out and visited with several of the neighbors along this corridor, and I'd be happy to do it once again. This concludes this evening's presentation. We'll be back before you at 5:30. So if you've got neighbors that you didn't see on here, I want you to encourage them to get on. If not, like I mentioned, use that survey. It's been a privilege to work with all of you. This has been quite the process. Concepts like this are difficult, and we recognize it. Also, besides concept 2 and 3 moving forward, the commissioners will be the ones who make the ultimate decision whether or not a project happens on Collister. So utilize that opportunity to speak to them directly if it's necessary. I'll be before you at a later date as I present this at the public hearing. We'll go over the options, and you're going to also have plenty of time before the public hearing to review the preferred concept. As I mentioned before, the technical team consists of representatives from City of Boise. Boise School District is notified of all of this. Valley Regional Transit is notified of all of this, and as well as ACHD. We have quite the technical team who spent a significant amount of time reviewing this. It's been a pleasure. Certainly look forward to hearing from you should you need anything. This concludes our presentation, includes our virtual open house, and I'll be back before you at 5:30. Have a good evening.